Looking through the submersible's viewfinder, he could see the sandy ocean floor, illuminated only by the lights of the submersible. His mind wandered to his passion, knowing as soon as he checked in with this submarine and the next, he could do what he always wanted to do, and find RMS Titanic. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Did you guys notice something different? We are freshening things up around here a little bit. This week we are back in action, and we get into the tragic loss of USS Scorpion, a nuclear-powered submarine that mysteriously disappeared until her wreckage was found. Before we get into her disappearance, let's look at her building and specs. USS Scorpion was a Skipjack-class nuclear-powered submarine that was ordered for the U.S. Navy on January 31, 1957. Her keel was laid down on August 20, 1958 by General Dynamics Electric Boat located in Groton, Connecticut. As for her specifications, she displaced 2,880 long tons when light on fuel and 3,075 long tons when full, having a deadweight tonnage of 195 long tons. Deadweight tonnage, for those that don't know, is a measure of how much weight a ship can carry, and this includes things like fuel, fresh water, ballast water, provisions, passengers, and crew. The Scorpion was 251 feet and 8 inches long, had a beam of 31 feet and 7.75 inches wide, and a draft of 29 feet and 10 inches tall. Her complement included 8 officers and 75 enlisted sailors. Now let's take a look at propulsion and armament. As for armament, she was armed with 6 21-inch torpedo tubes and 2 nuclear-tipped Mark 45 anti-submarine torpedoes. Her propulsion is where things get really interesting, at least to me. She was powered by one S5W nuclear reactor, and this was a reactor type used by the U.S. Navy to provide electricity generation and propulsion on warships and submarines. The S stood for submarine platform, the 5 stood for 5th generation core designed by the contractor, and the W stood for Westinghouse, which was the contracted designer. This pressurized water reactor's simplicity, over-design, and redundancy was intended for ease of operation and tolerance of battle damage. These characteristics would contribute greatly to the type's reliability, longevity, and excellent safety record. A pressurized water reactor is a type of light water nuclear reactor, and they constitute the large majority of the world's nuclear power plants. The primary coolant, in this case water, is pumped under high pressure to the reactor core where it is heated by the energy released by the fission of atoms. This water then flows to a steam generator, where the thermal energy is transferred to lower pressure water of a secondary system, and this generates steam, which turns steam turbines, in turn spinning an electric generator and producing electricity. Fission in nuclear reactors, for those not familiar with the process, is the firing of a neutron at a cell's nucleus, which contains neutrons and protons. This will shift the molecular structure of the atom, causing it to become another isotope of that element, usually uranium-235, and filling it with kinetic energy, which powers the whole process. This would be the process that powered USS Scorpion. Scorpion was launched on December 19, 1959, being sponsored by Elizabeth S. Morrison, the daughter of the last commander of the World War II-era USS Scorpion, Lieutenant Commander Maximilian Schmidt. His submarine had also been lost with all hands in 1944, oddly enough. She'd undergo sea trials and be completed shortly after this, and was commissioned on July 29, 1960, and Commander Norman B. Bessick would have control of her for now. Bessick was in charge of the Scorpion, but you guys are the ones in charge of the content here. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Alright, time to look at her career. Scorpion would be assigned to Submarine Squadron 6, Division 62, and with her squadron, she departed New London, Connecticut on August 24, 1960 for a 2-month-long deployment in Europe. While she was in Europe, she'd participate in exercises with NATO member navies and with 6 fleet units of the US Navy. She returned to New England in late October of 1960, training along the eastern seaboard up into May of 1961. On August 9, 1961, she returned to New London and then moved on to Norfolk, Virginia the following month. In 1962, she received a Navy Unit Commendation, which is a U.S. Navy award given to units that have distinguished themselves by outstanding heroism and action against the enemy, but not to the degree of earning the Presidential Unit Citation. For the remainder of her career, and like many Navy vessels before her, Norfolk would be her home port. Here, she specialized in developing nuclear submarine warfare tactics, playing both the hunter and prey in exercises up and down the Atlantic coast, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. She underwent an overhaul at Charleston, South Carolina, lasting from June of 1963 to May of 1964, and she'd resume duty in the late spring. However, her regular duties were halted once more from August 4th to October 8th of 1964 for a transatlantic patrol, and she conducted a similar patrol in European waters in the spring of 1965. During this time was a particularly scary time during the Cold War, and so submarine patrolling on both sides was common. In 1966, she was deployed for special operations, which I don't have the details of, and upon returning home, her commanding officer at the time received a Navy Commendation Medal for outstanding foresight, leadership, and professional skill. Other officers and crew aboard Scorpion were cited for meritorious achievement as well, so the accolades kept rolling in. It is reported that she had entered an inland Russian sea during what was called a Northern Run in 1966, and here her crew filmed a Soviet missile launch through her periscope before fleeing from Soviet Navy ships. After running home from the Soviets, she'd be overhauled. She entered Norfolk Naval Shipyard on February 1st, 1967 for a refueling overhaul. Instead of this much-needed massive change, she'd only get a quick emergency slap of a band-aid to get quickly back on duty. The preferred method for repairs was through the SubSafe program, and this required increased submarine overhaul times spanning from 9 to 36 months total. SubSafe required intense evaluations of submarine component quality, along with multiple improvements and scrutinous structural inspections, mostly focused on hull welding, and this was examined with ultrasonic testing. The Cold War put more and more pressure on the officers of the U.S. Submarine Force Atlantic, also called SUBLANT, and so they started cutting corners. The last overhaul of USS Scorpion cost 1/7 of the maintenance overhauls performed on other nuclear submarines at the same time. This was because they were worried about the, quote, high percentage of time offline for all of these nuclear attack submarines, which was estimated at about 40% of total available duty time. This was significant considering the US and USSR both thought the other's attack was imminent. So, as a result, her original full overhaul was vastly reduced. Long overdue and critical SubSafe work was not completed, like installing a new central valve control system. Even more crucially, her emergency system was not corrected for the same problems that had destroyed USS Thresher, also lost in the Atlantic. The Charleston Naval Shipyard swore up and down that the emergency main ballast tank blow, or EMBT system, worked as it was. However, SUBLANT said the opposite, and that the EMBT was, quote, tagged out, meaning it was listed as unusable. Perceived problems with the overhaul times led to a delay on all SubSafe work into 1967. Scorpion's reduced overhaul was approved on June 17, 1966 by Chief of Naval Operations Admiral David Lamar McDonald. On July 20th, McDonald deferred SubSafe's extensions, otherwise deemed essential since 1963. The threat of nuclear war was so hot that safety was thrown on the back burner. Moving into 1967 and 1968, she would go into a refresher training session and undergo weapons system acceptance tests in late October of 1967. She'd receive a new commanding officer as well, Francis Slattery. After type training in Norfolk, she was underway on February 15, 1968 for Mediterranean Sea deployment, operating with the 6th Fleet into May and then heading for home after this. As you might have guessed, Scorpion started to experience mechanical problems, including a chronic problem with freon leakage from refrigeration systems. Freon, if you didn't know, is the name for a number of halocarbon products, and they are stable, non-flammable, low-toxicity gases or liquids that are generally used as refrigerants or as aerosol propellants. Freon is even used in cars for air conditioning in most cases, so you might not have known it, but Freon has touched your life in some way. An electrical fire would break out in an escape trunk when a water leak shorted out a shore power connection, but there were no injuries or deaths. There was no evidence that Scorpion's speed was restricted in any way in May of 1968, though it was observing a conservative depth of 500 feet due to the incomplete implementation of the planned post-Thresher safety checks and modifications. When she left the Mediterranean on May 16, 1968, Scorpion dropped 2 men off at Naval Station Rota in Spain, one for a family emergency and the other for health-related reasons. Some U.S. ballistic missile submarines operated from the U.S. Naval Base Rota, and this is significant because it is believed that Scorpion provided noise cover for USS John C. Calhoun when they both headed out into the Atlantic. Alongside Soviet intelligence trawlers, Soviet fast nuclear attack submarines were trying to detect and track down U.S. submarines leaving Rota, and in this case, there were 2 fast 32-knot Soviet November-class hunter-killer submarines. After this, Scorpion was tasked with observing Soviet naval activities in the Atlantic near the Azores, with an Echo II class submarine operating with the Soviet task force in this area, as well as a Russian guided missile destroyer. Scorpion stuck around and listened to and observed the Soviets over time, then preparing to head back to Norfolk. This was late in May of 1968. Scorpion tried to send radio traffic to Naval Station Rota for an unusually long time, starting just before midnight on May 20th and ending after midnight on May 21st, 1968. However, they were only able to reach a Navy communications station located in Nicomedes, Greece. This station forwarded Scorpion's messages to Comsa Blant, which is the commander of the Submarine Force Atlantic. Commander Slattery's last message landed on the desk of Lieutenant John Roberts, and in this message, Slattery detailed the fact that they were closing on the Soviet submarine and research group, running at a steady 15 knots at a depth of about 350 feet, quote, to begin surveillance of the Soviets. Scorpion was expected back in port in Norfolk on May 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. However, she didn't arrive, and after several hours, the Atlantic Fleet launched a sea and air search during the peak search period from May 28th to the 30th. This search involved as many as 55 ships and 35 aircraft searching for the lost submarine. A brief radio message containing the submarine's codename, Brandywine, was received by several search parties on the evening of May 29th, though the source could not be identified in the search area derived from the bearings of the radio message. Now, there's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot of theories and mystery, but don't worry, we will get there. The answers or lack thereof might be frustrating, but by the end of this, you'll have enough information to make your own mind up. As for the Navy, they suspected possible mechanical failures and launched a search, but sadly, Scorpion and her crew were declared, quote, presumed lost as of June 5th, 1968. The vessel was struck from the Naval Vessel Register on June 30th of that year, and the search still continued with a team of mathematical consultants led by John Pena Craven, the chief scientist of the Navy's Special Projects Division. The use and methods of the Bayesian search theory, which utilizes Bayesian statistics to search for lost objects and was initially developed during the search for a hydrogen bomb lost off the coast of Palomares, Spain in January of 1966 in the Palomares B-52 crash. I've considered making an air crash channel, and that would be something on the list, so let me know if that would be something you'd be interested in. Some reports point to a large secret search that was launched 3 days before Scorpion was expected back from patrol. This and other declassified information led to speculation that the Navy knew about Scorpion's destruction far before the public search started. To me, that's shady. What are they hiding? At the end of October of 1968, the USNS Musar, the Navy's oceanographic research ship, discovered sections of the hull of USS Scorpion at the bottom of the northern Atlantic, roughly 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores in more than 9,800 feet of water. This discovery was after the Navy released sound tapes from its underwater SOSUS listening system, which had sounds of the destruction of Scorpion. The Court of Inquiry was reconvened after this, and other ships, including the Bathyscaphe Trieste II, were sent to the scene to take pictures and collect data. A bathyscaphe is a free-diving, self-propelled deep-sea submersible consisting of a crew cabin similar to that of a bathysphere, but suspended below a float rather than from a surface cable like in the classic bathysphere design. Craven received a lot of credit for finding the wreckage of Scorpion. However, Gordon Hamilton was instrumental in defining a compact search box, and the wreck was found within the search area. Hamilton was an acoustics expert, and he pioneered the use of hydroacoustics to pinpoint Polaris missile splashdown locations. As well as this, he had established a listening station in the Canary Islands, and this station had gotten a clear signal of the vessel's pressure hull as it imploded when passing its crushed depth. Crush depth, by the way, is defined as the maximum depth a submarine can withstand based upon the strength of its hull before it implodes. Naval Research Laboratory scientist Chester Buchanan used a towed camera sled of his own design aboard Mizar, and he finally located Scorpion. We are going to look at the damage on Scorpion's wreckage that was reported by researchers, and after that, we'll look into the investigations. Once Scorpion's bow made contact with the Globigerina ooze on the sea floor, it skidded and created a large trench. The sail had been dislodged, as the hull of the operations compartment upon which it perched disintegrated, and was on its port side. One of her running lights was in the open position, as if it had been on the surface at the time of the mishap, though it might have been left open during her recent nighttime stop at Rota. One pilot aboard Trieste II that had dived on Scorpion said that the shock of the implosion might have knocked the light into the open position, and I honestly could see that myself. In 1969, the second Navy investigation would commence, and they would extensively utilize photographic, video, and eyewitness inspections. In this investigation, it was suggested that Scorpion's hull was crushed by implosion forces as she passed below crush depth. The Structural Analysis Group, which included Peter Palermo, director of the Naval Ship Systems Command Submarine Structures, plainly saw that the torpedo room was entirely intact. However, it had been pinched by excessive sea pressure. The operations compartment collapsed at frame 33, and this was the king frame of the hull, reaching its structural limit first and foremost. Immediately after this was the conical or cylindrical transition piece at frame 67, with the boat being snapped in half by massive hydrostatic pressure at an estimated depth of 1,530 feet. The operations compartment was almost entirely decimated by sea pressure, and the engine room had telescoped 50 feet forward into the hull due to collapse pressure, when the cone-to-cylinder transition junction failed between the auxiliary machine space and the engine room. The only damage noticed on the torpedo room compartment was apparently a hatch missing from the forward escape trunk. Palermo pointed out this would have occurred when water pressure entered the torpedo room right at the moment of implosion. The sail was then torn off, with the hull beneath it folding inward. The propulsion shaft came clean out of the sub, with the engineering section collapsing inward in a telescoping fashion. After this, she tumbled down another 9,000 feet to the bottom of the Atlantic. In 1986, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution's submersible Alvin captured photos of the wreck that were released by the Navy in 2012, and they showed the broken inboard end of the propulsion shaft. Let's look at the investigations, and there were two. The first was the Court of Inquiry in 1968, and their findings were released on January 31st, 1969. Shortly after the implosion, the Navy assembled a Court of Inquiry to investigate the incident and publish the findings of the most likely cause for her loss. Vice Admiral Bernard L. Austin presided over the court, and he'd presided over the inquiry when the Thresher was lost, so this must have felt like deja vu to him. When ruling out sabotage, the report stated, quote, "The certain cause of the loss of the Scorpion cannot be ascertained from evidence now available." Essentially, it was inconclusive at the time. Later in 1984, the Norfolk Virginian pilot and the Ledger Star obtained documents related to the inquiry, and they reported that the disaster was likely caused by the detonation of a torpedo while the Scorpion's crew worked tirelessly to disarm it. The U.S. Navy declassified many of the inquiry's documents in 1993, though this inquiry remains inconclusive. Now we move on to the second investigation, which was the Naval Ordnance Laboratory report, published in 1970. This was the result of an extensive year-long analysis of Gordon Hamilton's hydroacoustic signals of the submarine's implosion that was conducted by Peter Sherman, Ermine Christian, and Robert Prince of the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. These three physicists were experts on undersea explosions, their sound signatures, and destructive effects, so this was the elite team to be working on the investigation. Price was also an open critic of Craven from earlier, so take that into account. According to these three, the death noises likely occurred at 2,000 feet when the hull finally failed. Fragments then continued in a free fall for 9,000 feet, and this differs from the conclusions drawn by Craven and Hamilton, who pursued an independent set of experiments as part of the same Phase 2 probe during this investigation. This demonstrated that alternate interpretations of the hydroacoustic signals were possibly based on the submarine's depth at the time it was stricken, as well as other operational conditions. The Structural Analysis Group, or SAG as we will call them, concluded that an explosive event was unlikely and was highly dismissive of Craven and Hamilton's tests, arguing that the absence of a bubble pulse is absolute evidence that no torpedo explosion occurred outside or inside of the hull. A bubble pulse occurs in an underwater explosion for those confused on the term. Craven had attempted to prove that Scorpion's hull could swallow the bubble pulse of a torpedo detonation by having Gordon Hamilton detonate small charges next to air-filled steel containers. However, SAG had the 1970 Naval Ordnance Laboratory letter, which was the acoustic study of Scorpion destruction sounds by Prince and Christian, and this was a strong supporting study within SAG's own report. In its conclusion and recommendation section, the NOL acoustic study explains, quote, "The first Scorpion acoustic event was not caused by a large explosion, either internal or external to the hull. The probable depth of occurrence and the spectral characteristics of the signal support this. In fact, it is very unlikely that any of the Scorpion acoustic events were caused by explosions." Well, how did the NOL come to this conclusion? They compared the sounds from Scorpion to that of torpedoing and sinking sounds from the decommissioned submarine USS Sterlet in the Pacific in early 1969. Price found the Navy's scheduled sinking of the Sterlet fortunate for their case, though Sterlet was a small World War II-era diesel-electric submarine of a very different construction and design than that of Scorpion with regard to its pressure hull and other characteristics. Its sinking created 3 identifiable sounds, whereas Scorpion's sinking created 15. That is 5 times the number of identifiable sounds. The NOL acoustic study provided a highly debated explanation as to how Scorpion reached her crush depth by anecdotally referring to the near-loss incident of the diesel submarine USS Chopper in January of 1969, when a power problem caused her to sink almost to crush depth before surfacing once more. In a May 2003 N77 letter, the following statement appears to dismiss the NOL theory entirely and points the finger once more at an explosion forward. Quote, "The Navy has extensively investigated the loss of Scorpion through the initial court of inquiry and the 1970 and 1987 reviews by the Structural Analysis Group. Nothing in those investigations caused the Navy to change its conclusion that an unexplained catastrophic event occurred." The Navy's official results as of right now are inconclusive. However, the finding of facts in 1993 still echoes remnants of Craven's torpedo theory, stating, quote, "The first cataclysmic event was of such magnitude that the only possible conclusion is that a cataclysmic event, explosion, occurred resulting in uncontrolled flooding, most likely the forward compartments." In November of 2012, the U.S. Submarine Veterans, an organization with over 13,800 members, formally asked the U.S. Navy to reopen the investigation on the sinking of USS Scorpion, and the Navy rejected this request. A private group, including family members of the lost submariners, stated they would investigate the wreckage on their own, since it's located in international waters and legal to do so. There's no conclusions from this as of the recording of this episode. This sinking may be inconclusive so far, but the love of our patrons is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. This episode couldn't be possible without our lovely patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to support the channel and future episodes, go to patreon.com/shipwrecksunday to join. Okay, it's time to get into her wreckage and possible theories for her loss. USS Scorpion's wreck currently rests at a depth of 9,800 feet, roughly 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores, on the eastern edge of the Sargasso Sea. She sits on a sandy seabed at 32 degrees 54.9 minutes north and 33 degrees 08.89 minutes west. The U.S. Navy periodically revisits Scorpion to determine if the wreckage has been disturbed and to test for the release of any fissile materials from her nuclear reactor or two nuclear weapons. Other than a few photos from deep-water submersibles in 1968 and 1985, the Navy has never publicized any of these surveys they've conducted. The last photos were taken by none other than Robert Ballard and his team of oceanographers from Woods Hole using the submersible Alvin in 1985, and shortly after this, he would go on to find the wreck of RMS Titanic. The U.S. Navy secretly lent Alvin to Ballard to visit the wrecks of Scorpion and Thresher under the condition he could use Alvin to find Titanic. Because Scorpion is radioactive, the U.S. Navy does have to publish what specific environmental sampling they've done of the sediment, water, and marine life around the submarine to establish the impact on the deep ocean environment. This information is released annually, and it's required with all nuclear ships and submarines sunk. There is a lack of radioactivity around the wreckage that shows the nuclear reactor and ammunition is still intact, and no extraneous amounts of uranium has been found. That's good and well, but let's look at what you've been waiting for, the theories. Remember, these are theories and are not conclusive, and I am not stating that any one of these is true. You will decide that for yourself. Sound good? Okay, let's get into the first one, a hydrogen explosion during a battery charge. Two experts affirmed this one. Retired acoustics expert and longtime analyst for the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, Bruce Rule, who stated a hydrogen explosion sank Scorpion, and retired Rear Admiral Dave Oliver, who had experience in both nuclear submarines and diesel boats, stated that Scorpion was lost as a result of hydrogen buildup due to changes in the ventilation lineup while proceeding to periscope depth. After analysis of the ship's battery cells, this theory jumped to the top of the list for most likely cause. It is consistent with two small explosions aboard the submarine, roughly half a second apart, and these were picked up by hydrophones. The second theory is the accidental activation of a torpedo. In the classified version of the inquiry's report, which was publicized in 1993, there were accidents with Mark 37 torpedoes listed as the most probable causes for the loss of submarines, including a hot-running torpedo, an accidentally or deliberately launched torpedo, or the inadvertent activation of a torpedo by stray voltage. The acoustic homing torpedo, lacking a propeller guard and in fully ready condition, is theorized by some to have started running within the tube. Once released from the tube, the torpedo somehow became fully armed and went toward the nearest target, which would be USS Scorpion. There is a later theory that a fire within the torpedo room caused a torpedo to explode in the tube, and this is based upon John Craven's theory that a faulty battery had overheated. The Mark 46 silver zinc battery used in the Mark 37 torpedo had a tendency to overheat. In extreme cases, this could cause a fire that was strong enough to low-order detonation of the warhead. If this happened, it might have opened the boat's large torpedo-loading hatch and caused Scorpion to flood and sink. This would be the first case ever of Mark 46 batteries causing a detonation or explosion, however, so take that as you will. There's the possibility of the crew firing a defective torpedo, and Craven also put this one forward, stating a, quote, hot-running torpedo would have been fired to get rid of it, and the torpedo searching for a target would have turned on Scorpion. Malfunction of the trash disposal unit, something so minuscule, could have brought about the death of Scorpion as well, and this was brought forward by Vice Admiral Arnold F. Shade during the 1968 inquiry. He testified that a malfunction in the trash disposal unit caused rapid flooding when operated at periscope depth, and that other subsequent failures of material or personnel while dealing with this unit-induced flooding led to the submarine sinking. There's also the possibility that the sinking was due to structural damage, and this is supported by photos that show the submarine's detached shaft and propeller, missing a rotor blade. The detached shaft could have caused rapid flooding, according to experienced submariners in the U.S. Given that anti-submarine torpedoes were designed to seek the sound of the cavitation of the target submarine's propeller, this could be damage caused by such a weapon. Speaking of an anti-submarine torpedo, who else could have fired it other than the Soviets? This is the spiciest of the theories, but remember, it's just a theory. The theory goes that Scorpion was destroyed while on the way to gather intelligence on a Soviet naval group conducting operations in the Atlantic. While the mission for which the submarine was diverted from her original course back to Norfolk is on the record, the details are still classified naturally. Ed Offley's book Scorpion Down promotes a theory that she was sunk by a Soviet submarine during a standoff that started days before May 22nd. This is because of the intelligence mission Scorpion had just completed and was heading home from. The flotilla she had been spying on was already harassed by a different U.S. submarine, USS Hotto, and this is supported by crew eyewitness testimony, but nothing on the record. Multiple authors point at involvement by the KGB spy ring in the heart of the U.S. Navy's communications led by John Anthony Walker Jr., who is convicted of spying for the Soviets from 1967 to 1985. According to this theory, the U.S. Navy and the Soviet Navy agreed to hide the truth about the sinking of both USS Scorpion and K-129. To make this more alarming, 11 incidents like this were cited by the Navy minister in the British Labour government. However, let's look at the Soviet side of things. According to a translated article from Pravda, Moscow never once issued a fire order during the Cold War. This is disputed by the Royal Navy, with officers stating, quote, "There had been other occasions when harassed Russians had fired torpedoes to scare off trails." Further, the Navy Court of Inquiry official statement confirms that the Soviet naval group, including an Echo-2 submarine, was conducting a, quote, hydroacoustic operation in the area, but they were about 200 miles to the west of Scorpion's position at the time of the sinking. However, there were November-class submarines that were faster than Scorpion, which traveled at 29 knots, and the November-class could travel around 31 knots, so that could close the gap between Scorpion and a Russian submarine, but we may never know for certain. Remember, this is a theory, and so we may never truly know what happened with all of the alleged cover-ups and classified information. Regardless of what our thoughts are on the matter, the important thing to remember is that this is an inconclusive investigation into the sinking of the USS Scorpion, and until all of the information is available to the public, we may never know what truly happened. This is a shame, since the family members of those lost deserve closure as to what happened to their fathers, brothers, sons, and loved ones. Rest in peace to the men lost aboard USS Scorpion, and I hope their families will find justice sooner rather than later. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our episode on the Kursk K-141 submarine. Next week, we get into the story of P.S. Lady Elgin, the worst sinking on the Great Lakes. Thank you for tuning into Shipwreck Sunday, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.